The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small teacher's lounge at Roosevelt Elementary School as third-grade teacher Maria Santos approached Caitlin Clark with trembling hands. The WNBA star was there for what should have been a simple basketball court dedication, but what happened next would change everything. "Miss Clark," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the excited chatter of students in the nearby gymnasium. "I need to tell you something that's been breaking my heart for 15 years. Most of my students have never owned a single book, not one." Caitlin's smile faded as she looked through the doorway at the children bouncing basketballs, unaware that their teacher was about to share a secret that would transform their lives forever. What happened when 22,000 books arrived at that school 3 weeks later wasn't just magical. It was revolutionary. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need you to do something right now. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from, because what I'm about to share with you is happening in schools all across the world, and I want to see how far this message reaches about the power of education and hope. It was supposed to be a celebration. Roosevelt Elementary School in Des Moines had just received a brand new outdoor basketball court through the Caitlin Clark Foundation's Community Courts Initiative. The court was beautiful, regulation size with bright LED lighting, team benches, and the foundation's logo proudly displayed at center court. 500 students from Roosevelt and 3 neighboring schools had gathered in the gymnasium for the dedication ceremony before heading outside to see their new court. Caitlin stood at the microphone talking about the 3 pillars of her foundation: education, nutrition, and sports, the same values that had shaped her own success. The children listened intently as she explained how basketball had taught her about teamwork, perseverance, and never giving up on your dreams. But it was when she started talking about the importance of education that everything changed. "Reading opens doors," Caitlin told the packed gymnasium. "Books can take you anywhere you want to go, teach you anything you want to learn. Education and sports work together to build strong minds and strong bodies." The students applauded enthusiastically, many of them wearing handmade signs welcoming their basketball hero to their school. That's when Maria Santos, who had been teaching third grade at Roosevelt for 15 years, felt something break inside her chest. She'd been listening to Caitlin talk about the power of books and education, while knowing a painful truth that she'd never shared with anyone outside the school. Her students, bright and eager as they were, lived in a world where books were luxuries their families simply couldn't afford. Maria Santos had started teaching at Roosevelt Elementary 15 years ago, fresh out of college and full of idealistic dreams about inspiring young minds through literature. She quickly learned that the reality of teaching in an under-resourced school was far more challenging than anything her education classes had prepared her for. Roosevelt served a community where 87% of students qualified for free or reduced lunch. Many of her students came from single-parent households where working multiple jobs was the norm, not the exception. What broke Maria's heart most wasn't the lack of supplies or the outdated textbooks. It was watching her students' faces during reading time when she asked them about their favorite books at home. Year after year, the same pattern emerged: confused looks, uncomfortable silence, and eventually the admission that they didn't have books at home, not because they didn't want them, but because buying books meant choosing between literature and groceries, between stories and rent money. Maria had tried everything within her power to bridge this gap. She spent hundreds of dollars of her own modest teacher's salary buying books for her classroom library. She applied for grants, organized fundraisers, and even started a small lending program where students could take books home. But it was never enough. For every book she could provide, there were dozens of children who went home each day to houses where the only reading material might be junk mail or expired magazines. The most heartbreaking moment came during parent-teacher conferences, when parents would apologetically explain that they couldn't help with reading homework because they weren't strong readers themselves, or because they worked night shifts and weren't home when children did homework, or because they simply didn't have books to read together. These weren't parents who didn't care about education. These were parents doing everything they could to provide basic necessities while dreaming of giving their children opportunities they'd never had themselves. After Caitlin's presentation, as the students filed out to see the new basketball court, Maria found herself standing alone in the gymnasium, wrestling with whether to approach this basketball superstar with her classroom's reality. She had heard about the Caitlin Clark Foundation's work with education, and she knew this might be her only chance to advocate for her students in a way that could actually make a difference. That's when she made the decision to walk to the teacher's lounge, where Caitlin was taking a brief break before the outdoor ceremony. With her hands shaking and her heart pounding, Maria introduced herself and shared the truth that had been weighing on her for years. "Miss Clark," Maria said, "what you said about books opening doors, it's beautiful and it's true. But I have to tell you something. Most of my students have never owned a book of their own. They love stories, they love learning, but they go home to houses where there simply aren't any books. When we do reading activities and I ask them to bring a favorite book from home, they look at me like I've asked them to bring a unicorn." Caitlin set down her water bottle and gave Maria her complete attention. There was something about the teacher's quiet desperation that reminded Caitlin of her own elementary school years, when her parents made sure she always had books, but she understood that not every family had the same resources. "Tell me more," Caitlin said simply. "I want to understand exactly what your students are facing." Maria took a deep breath and shared stories that she'd been carrying alone for too long. She told Caitlin about Emma, a brilliant 8-year-old who created elaborate stories during creative writing time but had never owned a single book. She talked about Marcus, who was reading 2 grade levels above his peers but had to rely entirely on the school library because his family couldn't afford to buy books. She described the look of wonder on children's faces during the few times per year when book fairs visited the school, and how most of her students could only look, never buy. "The worst part," Maria confided, "is that I can see their potential. These kids are smart, curious, creative, but they're falling behind not because they can't learn, but because they don't have the tools at home to practice what we learn at school. Reading is like any other skill. It requires practice, but how can they practice without books?" Caitlin listened to every word, her expression growing more serious with each story. When Maria finished, there was a long moment of silence. Then, Caitlin asked a question that would change everything. "Maria, if you could wave a magic wand and give your students exactly what they need to succeed in reading, what would that look like?" Before you hear Maria's answer, I need to pause and ask you something. If you were a teacher watching brilliant children struggle simply because they didn't have books at home, how would that make you feel? Tell me in the comments, and while you're sharing that, let me know where you're watching from too. Maria's answer came from 15 years of frustrated dreams and sleepless nights, worrying about her students' futures. "I would make sure every single child has a library at home, not just one book, but books they can choose, books that match their interests, books they can read again and again. I would want them to feel the same excitement about getting a new book that other kids feel about getting a new toy." She paused, then continued with growing passion. "And it's not just about having books. It's about ownership. When a child owns a book, it becomes part of their identity. They can write their name in it, carry it with them, share it with siblings, keep it forever. There's something powerful about a child being able to say, 'This is my book.' It changes how they see themselves as readers." Caitlin was quiet for another long moment, and Maria worried that she had shared too much, asked for too much. But then Caitlin pulled out her phone and made a call that would transform Roosevelt Elementary and dozens of other schools. "Mary," Caitlin said to her foundation director, "I need you to contact Scholastic immediately. We need to talk about books, a lot of books." What happened in the next 3 weeks was unprecedented in the history of Roosevelt Elementary School. The Caitlin Clark Foundation, in partnership with Scholastic's United States of Readers program, orchestrated what would become one of the largest single school book donations in Iowa history. But this wasn't just about quantity. This was about dignity, choice, and the fundamental belief that every child deserves to own books. The planning was meticulous. Rather than simply dropping off boxes of random books, the foundation worked with Scholastic to create a personalized book selection process. Each student at Roosevelt, and eventually at 3 other partner schools, would receive a carefully curated collection of books matched to their reading level and interests. Adventure stories for kids who loved excitement, science books for curious minds, poetry collections for creative souls, and picture books for emerging readers. But the real magic was in the details. Each book would be brand new, not used or donated from someone else's collection. Each book would come with a special book plate that read, "This book belongs to," with space for the child's name. Each child would receive not just one book, but enough books to create their own personal library at home. The day the books arrived at Roosevelt Elementary was unlike anything the school had ever experienced. 22,000 books, packed in carefully labeled boxes, filled the entire gymnasium. The basketball court that had brought Caitlin to the school in the first place became a sorting station where volunteers organized books by grade level and reading interest. Maria Santos stood in the doorway of the gymnasium, tears streaming down her face as she looked at more books than she had seen in her entire 15-year teaching career, all destined for the homes of her students. She had dreamed of this moment but never believed it could actually happen. When the students arrived at school that morning, they found their gymnasium transformed into a wonderland of books. Tables were arranged around the basketball court, each one loaded with carefully sorted collections. Volunteers from the Caitlin Clark Foundation, scholastic representatives, and teachers from all 4 participating schools worked together to guide children through their personal book selection process. But the moment that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing happened when 8-year-old Emma, the same little girl Maria had mentioned to Caitlin, picked up her first book. It was a story about a young girl who dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Emma held the book against her chest and whispered, "Is this really mine? Like, really, really mine forever?" When Maria nodded and showed her the bookplate where she could write her name, Emma's reaction was so pure, so joyful, that the volunteer photographer captured the exact moment when ownership of her first book transformed this little girl's understanding of herself as a reader. That photograph would later become the centerpiece of the Caitlin Clark Foundation's educational initiatives. The distribution process took the entire day, but no one was in a hurry. Children moved from table to table, examining books, reading first chapters, asking questions about stories. Teachers helped students find books that matched their interests. Parents who had been called to help with the event watched in amazement as their children selected personal libraries that would have cost hundreds of dollars to purchase. Marcus, the advanced reader Maria had mentioned, ended up with a collection of chapter books that would challenge and engage him for months. Emma chose stories about brave girls and adventures in space. Shy students found books about overcoming fears. Athletic kids discovered sports biographies. Every child left school that day carrying not just books, but possibility. The impact was immediate and profound. Maria noticed changes in her students within days. Children who had struggled with reading motivation suddenly couldn't wait for reading time. Students began bringing their new books to school to share favorite passages with friends. Parents reported that bedtime had transformed from a battle to a beloved routine centered around reading together. But the most powerful change was in how the students saw themselves. Children who had never owned books suddenly identified as readers. They talked about their favorite authors, debated story endings, and made reading recommendations to classmates. The simple act of book ownership had fundamentally shifted their educational identity. 6 weeks after the book distribution, standardized reading scores at Roosevelt Elementary showed improvement across all grade levels. More importantly, library usage increased by 300% as students sought to find more books like the ones they owned at home. Teachers reported that reading comprehension activities were more successful because students were practicing reading skills outside of school for the first time. The transformation wasn't limited to academics. The book distribution had created a sense of pride and possibility that spread throughout the entire school community. Students carried themselves differently, parents engaged more actively in education, and teachers found renewed energy for their profession. Caitlin returned to Roosevelt Elementary 3 months later for a special reading celebration. Instead of talking about basketball, she spent the afternoon in Maria's classroom, listening to students read from their favorite books. The confidence in their voices, the joy in their storytelling, and the pride in their ownership was everything Maria had dreamed of when she first approached Caitlin in that teacher's lounge. During the celebration, Maria stood up to address the packed classroom of students, parents, and foundation volunteers. 3 months ago, I told Miss Clark that my students had never owned books. Today, I can say that every child in this room has a personal library at home. But more than that, every child in this room now knows they are readers, they are learners, they are capable of anything. The Roosevelt Elementary book distribution became the model for the Caitlin Clark Foundation's expanded educational initiatives. The success led to partnerships with schools across Iowa and Indiana, eventually distributing over 100,000 books to students who had never owned them before. But for Maria Santos and her third-grade class, the numbers weren't what mattered most. What mattered was the look in Emma's eyes when she finished her first chapter book and immediately asked Maria to help her find another one by the same author. What mattered was Marcus starting a reading club with his neighbors using the books from his personal collection. What mattered was the parent who called Maria to say that reading together had become the best part of her day with her child. The magic that happened when 22,000 books arrived at Roosevelt Elementary wasn't really about the books themselves. It was about dignity, possibility, and the fundamental truth that every child deserves to own the tools of learning. It was about a teacher brave enough to share an uncomfortable truth and a basketball star humble enough to listen and act. Today, Maria Santos still teaches third grade at Roosevelt Elementary. Her classroom library has tripled in size thanks to continued foundation support, but more importantly, she no longer has students who have never owned books. The reading culture at Roosevelt has completely transformed, with students regularly recommending books to each other and teachers incorporating more literature-based learning into every subject. If this story moved you, I need you to share two things in the comments. First, tell me where you're watching from, because stories like this need to reach educators and students everywhere. Second, tell me what moment in this story touched you most deeply. Was it Maria's courage in sharing the truth? Was it Emma holding her first book? Was it seeing an entire school community transformed by the power of book ownership? Your comments help spread this message of hope and possibility to people who might need to hear it. Sometimes the most powerful changes start with someone brave enough to say what everyone else is thinking and someone caring enough to turn that truth into action.